Wow, I can't get over how effective these lures are. It's got that cripple rolling action just like rolling shad, but the fish are much faster. These fish are in an aggressive mindset here and they are just slamming.
Guys, Kel Kellogg here. I've had a couple people reach out to me in the last 24 hours asking about what is the difference between a holdover trout, a native trout, and a wild trout, and how do you tell the difference? I guess there's been some back and forth out there on social media about this subject, and if you want to find crazy people and get into crazy arguments, you know social media is a great place to find that. And I don't engage in that stuff anymore. Back when I was younger, I used to go back and forth with guys on Facebook and stuff, but not so much anymore. Got better things to do. But I think I can shed some light on the concept of holdover trout, planted trout, wild trout, and native trout. Let's start with native trout. And you know, a native trout is a fish that lives probably in a stream, possibly in a lake, but since so many of our lakes are now reservoirs, you know, i.e. lakes where there was never a lake before, it doesn't really apply. But native fish refers to a native stock of fish. Maybe up in the high Sierras, there's a creek where the native rainbow trout population still exists, and those fish have been replicating since the last ice age. They reproduce successfully. Those are native trout. A brown trout here in California, it can never be a native trout because there weren't any brown trout here, you know, 200 years ago. They were introduced from the East Coast, and before that they were introduced to North America from Europe. So you're never gonna have a native brown trout. Now you can have a wild brown trout, and you know, some of this stuff's up to personal definition, you know, your perception. Here's my perception on a wild fish. You could certainly have a wild brown trout. Just because it's wild doesn't make it a native, but we have brown trout here in lakes. Lake Elminor is a great example. Those browns run up the creeks, they spawn, they reproduce. The little browns, they re-enter the lake, and some of them get very large. Those are wild brown trout. They're not natives, but they are wild. I also consider fish, you know, that maybe are planted by the DFW. I don't know if they stock fish by planes anymore, but that was common back in the 50s and 60s. They'd fly over a Sierra lake and they'd drop little fingerling trout. And those trout, they were on their own. They had to figure out how to feed, how to survive, what to eat, stuff like that. Clearly, those are wild fish. Now, they're not native fish. They were being planted from an airplane, sometimes in lakes that didn't have any fish at all. So, wild, yes. Native, no. What's a planted trout? Well, in my view, a planted trout is a trout that's, you know, been trucked to the lake in a truck, dumped into the water. And there's a lot of research on this. Some folks say 90% of planted trout die. Some folks say the number is 75%. When I say die, I mean some of them can't find food. Some of them get caught by anglers. Some of them get eaten by otters or cormorants or whatever. Talking about the mortality rate, and it seems to hover between about 70 and 90%, okay? The balance of the fish that are able to figure out what to eat and are able to evade anglers, those fish turn into what I would call, and what a lot of folks call, holdovers. Now, some guys will tell you they could tell 100% of the time the difference between a planted trout and a holdover. And other guys will assert that they can never tell the difference. You can never predict which trout is planted and which trout is a holdover. And I think both guys are right to some degree. Check out this 12-pound trout's picture here. Look at the trout. The trout is very, very heavy. Typically, you know, in almost all situations, rainbow trout in the wild don't get that thick, that bulky. They just don't have that many calories put in front of them that they can easily, you know, eat and digest like they do in a hatchery. Therefore, this big trout it's definitely a new planter. It's big and bulky, and look at its tail. Its tail is rubbed. You know, fish that are in a hatchery, typically they have rubbed fins, rubbed tails, because they're living in a cement raceway type environment, they rub up against the concrete as they're moving their tail, and part of that tail wears off. That's why a lot of guys call planted trout round tails, because they have their tail and their fins sometimes are rubbed off. Is a holdover superior to that fish? Some guys think so, some guys don't. That's up to you to decide for yourself. Planted trout, they're fun to catch, they're fun to eat, they're fun to put in a smoker. I love them, but I love holdovers too. Now look at this trout right here. This is a holdover trout from Collins Lake. One of my clients caught this on a trolling fly last year. Look at the tail on that fish. It has a big square tail, and if you looked at it closely on the boat, you could see where the tail had healed. At one point, this was a hatchery trout, but it had assimilated into the environment at Collins Lake. It had started eating shad. It had leaned out. See how lean the fish is? It looks more like a steelhead than that 12-pound planter I showed you a picture of. So typically what you're gonna see with a holdover trout is you're gonna see that they're longer, they're leaner, they typically fight harder, and typically their fins and their tail are fully healed, and you can often see where the new growth on the tail and on the fins took place. So that's how I define a holdover. Can you always tell which trout's a holdover versus which trout is a wild fish? Not really. What's the difference between a wild fish and a holdover? Not much. I mean, if you have a holdover in a lake and it spawns, its offspring are going to be wild fish. So where does a holdover become a wild fish? That's a blurred line, and it's not really even an important line, because now we're talking about definition, you know, and if you're fighting a fish and you like the way it fights and you put it in a pan and you eat it and you like the way it tastes, what do you care? So, you know, sometimes we get caught up in this little minutia, and guys will argue about it, and guys will get very passionate about it, and they'll get all ego involved in it, and they'll try to knock somebody and demonstrate that they're right and they're wrong. But you know, that's really a waste of time. Those guys should get out on the water and spend more time fishing. That's what I think. But that's kind of how I break it down. You know, fresh planters, typically they're more robust in the body, they're fatter fish, they tend to have rounded tails, rounded fins, stuff like that. Holdovers, they tend to lean out, get a little more acrobatic, a little more athletic. Their tails, their fins tend to heal. Wild fish, they could be planted, but they've assimilated into the environment, and they can survive just fine on their own. You know, they're good to go. Those fish may, even if you've planted them, if you've been planted out of an airplane, those fish might even find a tributary and spawn and put more wild fish into the system. Native fish, those are the rarest of the rare, because those are fish that still exist in streams and lakes where they've existed pretty much since the last ice age. So that's how I break it down. Your mileage may vary. I'm Kel Kellogg. Hope this clears things up for some of the folks out there. I will catch you next time right here on YouTube. And if you're looking for gear to catch planters, wild fish, native fish, whatever kind of fish, get on over to fishhuntshoot.com and we will hook you up with what you need. Thank you, guys.